Welcome everyone and thanks for joining. So as you know, today's session is on procurement management, and the intention for this webinar session is not to bore you with the PMP processes and inputs and outputs, but it's more to bring in a real life perspective of the procurement management as to why the organizations have procurement and how you as a project manager should be aware of this knowledge area and how it makes sense for you in your day-to-day life as a project manager. Okay. To begin with, for this session, I thought that it's a good idea to have an understanding of the audiences whom I'm talking to, and that will also bring in a right sense of the details that I could share with you in today's session. So we have few polls, and Saket, if you could please have those polls, and let's not take a lot of time on these polls. Each of these polls would have 1 minute maximum for you guys. Just click on the button by selecting whatever is applicable and then put a submit.
This poll is live. Please quickly submit it. Manish, can you see the poll?
No, I can't, but I think maybe you can just...
Yeah, I will just give you the summary. So first poll, which is talking about what is your total project job experience, and we are getting majority is 5 to 10 years.
Okay.
So I move to the next one. Are you in the role of a project manager? So majority is saying yes. Okay. So majority nice. of the audience are working as a project manager. Now the third one is that have you experienced procurement in your real world experience? So do you do procurement management in your day-to-day life, kind of? So, okay, contrary to my expectation, majority 75% of the people are saying yes. I was not assuming that. So that's a good, that's a good thing. So I think we have people who are doing procurement. Okay, are you in IT industry? This is the final, the fourth one. There would be one more after this. So, yeah, this is going as per my expectation, but not 100%? That well, not 100%. It's 50-50. So 56% are in IT, and not 53% are from the IT, and 47% from the non-IT thing. So we have mix of the crowd, and that's why they have an experience of procurement. So okay. That is the final one. How many of you plan to take PMP? Okay. I think many of them are already certified.
Okay.
So there are few, let's see. So still we have a majority of audience who are planning to take PMP in next 3 months. So they would be interested in 65% of the audience are the one who are planning to take PMP in near future.
Okay, that's nice. Okay, so thanks, Saket. And I was also expecting that most of you would be from the IT industry. However, it's good to have a mix of IT and non-IT. Makes my job a bit difficult now because I don't have extensive non-IT experience. But let's start this session. This is a brief about me. Here are my contact details, my email ID. And I have more than 18 years of experience in IT industry, and I have been working around the globe, so have experience working in almost all the continents across the world. Okay. These are the ground rules. All of you would be auto-muted, so if you have any questions, you can probably type in as and when you want. We will have a short Q&A break in between, where we can answer your questions, and then the rest we would be taking at the end of the session. As I told you earlier, this session is not to focus on PMI or PMP specific processes. However, you can still ask those questions, and I would try to answer. If not, then we already have an expert, Saket, in that area, and maybe he can take those questions. Okay. So these are the few questions which now, I mean, 75% of you have experienced procurement in real life. I am not sure to what extent from start to end, or you were participating in a certain phase. But some of these questions would make sense for a project manager, whether his job is to manage the project or to do procurement management. What are his powers as a project manager in making procurement decisions? Does the project manager need to be a legal expert? Well, I joined my project and the contract was already in place, it's already signed. So what am I supposed to do? And what should be my priority? Should be to deliver as per the project plan or to do contract management? And how often can I change the contract? So these are typically some of the questions that a project manager who is not very experienced in the project management field would have with regards to the procurement management. My intention is to try and answer some of them or all of them, and if I have not been able to answer some of them, we can come back to this slide at the end and then we can see if any of those are still not answered. Okay, so this is the agenda for today's session. We have an introduction, then I will take you through or walk you through the entire procurement cycle, and then at the last, what should be the PM's role, how can PM contribute, what are PM's obligations when it comes to the procurement management. Okay. So before we discuss this slide as to why procure, I just want to have what is procurement? Procurement in a very simple term is purchasing. It's purchasing any goods, services or works from an outside external source who is outside your organization. Now, some of the companies are really big, have multiple group companies, and for such, procurement may also mean procuring or purchasing something within their group companies. So, but in general, it is purchasing any goods or services from outside the organization. Why do organizations procure? There are multiple reasons, and traditionally those who are in non-IT industry would know that there is a procurement when you require machinery, require goods to be purchased which are not produced within your organization. Those who are in IT industry, they know that procurement normally is seen as something buying it cheap from an outside organization. However, there are other reasons, as I mentioned here in the slide. Lack of competence within the organization could also trigger procurement. There could not be enough resources available at a given point of time. So, for example, there is a huge project which we want to embark upon, and we do not have enough expertise, enough volume of expertise within the organization, then we procure. There is also need to procure when we want to save cost, when we need to reduce cost, when there is not enough capex available. Those who are in industry for long would know what it means. It means capital expenditure, which is, every annual budget that an organization has will have a capex and an opex segment. So capex is capital expenditure, which is essentially any new initiative projects that is been taken in the organization would be funded through capex funding, and run the business, the operations would be funded through OPEX, operational expenditure. Okay. It can also happen that you procure when you need flexibility. For example, you have another priority task which is happening in the organization and you want to free your resources. In that case, you procure. And at the last, there are cases where you need to procure when you want to cover your organization against a potential risk. Now, this kind of procurement is typically seen when an organization would expand into territories which are not known to them. For example, if a multinational would set up a shop in India or any other country where they have no experience whatsoever, they would ideally go the procurement route, and then risk coverage happens. For example, that's an unknown territory, we do not know what kind of risk might happen, so let's procure and outsource the work. Okay, so these are some of the examples as to why the organization wants to procure. Now, before I move to the next slide, I think I should have included that in the poll. See, procurement, when I said in a very simple term, is you're purchasing something. So when I am purchasing, I have to purchase from a seller. So I am a buyer, and there has to be a seller for me to purchase something. So depending on which side of the procurement cycle you are in, whether you are belonging to a buyer organization or whether you are part of a seller organization, the whole exposure towards the procurement cycle would change. The whole mindset would change. So each procurement cycle would have a buyer, and at the same time there has to be one or multiple sellers supplying the goods or services to the buyer. Okay. So based on which part of the organization you are in, if you're working for a buyer organization or a seller, your exposure and your understanding of the procurement cycle will be different. From the PMP point of view, or from the PMP examination point of view, it is recommended that for the questions in this knowledge area, you have to by default be a buyer's project manager, unless otherwise it's clearly mentioned in the question. You have to assume that you are a project manager from the buyer's organization. But for the sake of this presentation, I would try to bring in perspective on both the sides as much as I can, because the next slide then you'll be able to appreciate what I meant by that. Oh, sorry. Okay. Before that, this slide talks about different levels of procurement that happens in an organization. Organization can go in for a strategic procurement, which can happen at the entire organization level. It can also procure for a given department or a given portfolio. And last, the procurement can happen for a project or a program. Now, I'll give you a simple example, which, assuming most of you are from India. If you would have heard a few years back, there was a telecom company called Uninor, which entered Indian market. I think it's not there anymore, but when they entered Indian market, they had a clear case that they wanted to break even in a shorter duration, which means that the amount of investment they wanted to do in India was limited, and they wanted to have the profit level reached to a certain level within 3, 4, 5 years, so that they break even in their operations. Which means that they didn't want to invest a lot in infrastructure in India, so they hired IT company, IT/hardware procurement company, asked them to buy all the hardware like switches, routers, facilities, and in turn they leased it from that IT company. So that IT company bought it, and Uninor committed that we would be leasing it for you for a given duration of the time. What does it mean? It means that they don't have to pay a whole lot of amount in procuring or buying those, the IT company would do it. But for example, if you were a project manager in that organization, in that case, as a project manager, you already have a vendor or a company which has been selected through this strategic sourcing. So you don't have to really go through the entire procurement cycle as a project manager, because you already know whom you have to work with as a vendor in case you need external expertise in your project. So what does a project manager do in such case? We will cover that later on. So just to bring in a perspective, the procurement does not necessarily, or rather I would say at a project level, there is a very rare case where you go out in the market and select a brand new supplier, unless it's something which has never been procured in the organization or something which is a niche skills. Otherwise, for any organization, there is already a list of preferred suppliers through whom you have to procure based on who fits the best for your requirement as a project manager. Okay. So I was talking about the procurement. So when you have to procure, you have to someone have to sell it. So we have sales and procurement in a box here. Now every time you procure or you sell, you have support from a legal department, from the contractual point of view, and from a commercial department, just to ensure that when you are procuring, you have the right price, and the legal department would ensure that the contract covers each and everything that you want to procure. Okay, so traditionally, these two departments, and especially when you are procuring goods, machineries, these two departments work very well in sync. So if you see, this model traditionally works very well. And just to bring in a brief perspective, again, as I said, this again is more relevant for those who are in IT industry. So if you were a project manager in an organization, say in late 70s or even early 80s or even late 80s, almost 100% of your staff would be part of the organization, would be employees of your organization. So most of the times, the sales in the procurement cycle would be related or relevant only to procuring machines or procuring non-manpower things. So project manager as such was not really a key entity into this whole procurement cycle, because when you have to buy machineries or when you have to buy non-manpower goods, all you need was a specification, and then float a tender, and then see who is the best provider in terms of cost or in terms of specification, and then hire. Okay. So however, early 90s onwards, especially in the services industry, in the IT industry, in pharma industry, in other industries, more and more manpower procurement started to happen. Okay, which means that when you are procuring manpower, it's not as simple as providing a specification on a given machinery or a goods and just procuring it. It is a bit more complicated than that, and that's where the project managers were getting involved. However, as you see here, the project manager's intersection with the legal, commercial, and the sales procurement department was very limited, and this was specifically a problem because the project manager was involved late, sometimes not involved at all till the sales and the procurement cycle got over. But the project manager was supposed to deliver with whatever vendor was selected, and project manager was obligated to deliver as per the time scope schedule. Okay. So this is the area where we had problem, and more organizations, through hard way of learning, through maturing their own processes, have realized that project manager has to be a part of the sales and procurement cycle as early as possible, and the PMP recommends that project manager has to be involved from the day one. He has to be involved in deciding what to procure. But not all organizations are there yet. Some of them are maturing faster than others, but I would say, based on my experience, I have not seen any organization where the procurement cycle begins or the sales cycle begins and the first thing they go out and hunt for a project manager. No, that's still very few organizations who are doing it. Okay, and especially the sales team. So if you are belonging to the organization who is on the seller side, the sales team, they have their own target. They have to sell. They have to close the sales cycle as soon as possible. So their focus, their priority is to sell as fast as they can, as much as they can. Whereas, in most of the cases, they fail to realize that when they sell, especially when they sell services, they have to deliver it. And when they have to deliver it, the person who is responsible to deliver, the project manager, if he is not confident of what you are promising to to your customer or to the buyer, then it becomes a scenario where the organization will not be able to deliver. and therefore obviously might end up into legal or commercial issues. Okay, so this is the right setup where the project manager, the sales, procurement, along with the legal and commercial interacts, works in tandem, and then completes the whole cycle, which is in best interest of both the buyer as well as the seller. Okay, so as you can see, the project manager has a role to play, and we will talk about it in detail. Okay, so he can influence on what to procure. He should ideally be a key contributor, and he should be able to provide critical inputs, especially for the content of the contract. Right. Now we will move on to the procurement cycle. Before we move on to the procurement cycle, since most of you, or rather 75% of you, have experienced procurement in real life, these are some of the terms, very high-level terms. The details ones we will come to that later. So these are really very high-level terms that you would have come across, and we will try to cover them in subsequent slides. Okay. So again, as I want to stress upon the fact that this is from the real life experience and not something to do with the PM book processes, though the color coding that you see in these boxes that I have do align with your initiation, planning, execution, monitoring, controlling, and the closing phases. So the blue boxes that you see here are all, if you want to align it with the PMP processes, are the planning phases. Okay. So how does the procurement cycle start? You have to decide what you need to procure. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, there could be several reasons for an organization, for a project or a program or a portfolio to procure. And if those reasons are sufficient enough for you to make a case that you need to procure, yes, you can decide. But at a project level or at any level when you procure, it is not as easy as saying, yes, I want to procure, so let's start floating the RFI or the other documents. Before you decide to proceed on the full-fledged procurement cycle, there has to be an approval in place. And that approval will be based on how the organization processes are defined. So as a project manager, you might have to have an approval from a steering group, and the steering group would then look into whether the organization policy is in line with whatever you want to procure. And then once you get a green flag that yes, you can go ahead and procure, the next step for you is to have the initial scope defined. At this stage, you don't really have to have a very detailed 100% perfect definition of the scope defined here, but the initial scope has to be defined. And in case of non-manpower procurement, you need to have your specifications in place. Okay. And once you have that, you have to have a procurement plan, which is of course part and parcel or integral part of your project management plan. Now you need to be aware of the fact that procurement plan, especially the cost and the schedule of procuring a given goods or services, will depend on which organization you are working for. Some of the organizations have very lengthy processes. Some of the organizations have very short processes. The intention here is to tell you that in your project management plan, when you decide to procure, you have to keep sufficient buffer in your schedule. From the time you start the procurement or till the time you have the procured team on board working for your project, you have to ensure that that time frame is taken into consideration when you have the overall project management plan in place. So It's not just saying that, okay, I want to procure something and then let's start rolling. If you do not incorporate how much time it is going to take you to procure in your project management plan, you will be in trouble. Okay. At the same time, the cost factor. So when you are procuring, you have to have your legal department, you have to have your commercial department, and maybe some subject matter expertise to define the scope for you. The cost of all these resources have to be bared by your project, and based on how long the procurement cycle is, you need to make sure that you also take into consideration the cost on your project. So you have to have the provision for time and cost and for your procurement team when you are preparing your project management plan. Okay. Once your procurement plan is complete, okay, you also have all your documents, what we call as a procurement statement of work ready, your templates ready, your source selection criteria, on what basis you are going to create or select a seller. All those documents or artifacts would be ready with you before you move on to the actual procurement. Okay, so all the red boxes as you see here are from the PMP point of view, planning phase. Okay, now request for information. Now that's an optional step. Now when do you go for RFI? When you decide you want to procure and there has not been any procurement done in that particular area in past in your organization, which means that you do not have an understanding of who are the best sellers in this particular area. That's where you float an RFI, which is called as request for information, and you float it to a large pool of sellers. At this point of time, you don't provide them with detailed information of what services you want to procure. A high-level information is sufficient. You may choose not to provide any information of what you want to procure, but you request information from them in terms of their competence, in terms of their financial health, in terms of how long the company has been in this area, what is your financial strength, in which countries do you operate, give us some of your references, give us some of your best products. It gives you more of an understanding of whether the seller fits in your initial criteria of whom you want to work with. So RFI is a stage which is an optional stage. It is used when you have no experience of procuring in that given area before, and then you have large pool of sellers. So based on the RFI response, then you select, down select as we call, a few handful of sellers with whom you want to work further down the procurement cycle, right? So request RFP, the float RFP to the down selected seller is the next step, and here ideally you should specify your entire scope as much as you know at that point of time. Okay, so request for proposal is a stage where you have almost 100% of your scope ready. This is an ideal scenario. In real life, it doesn't happen all the time, but your aim should be that you have as exhaustive scope defined in your procurement statement of work. Now, once you float an RFP, you need to remember that based on the complexity of what you are procuring, based on where your selected sellers are, from which part of the world, all those things you need to take into consideration when you're floating RFP, because it takes time for the sellers to come back. If you're expecting a quality response, you have to provide sufficient time for them to provide a quality response. Now, most of the sellers or some of the sellers would have no experience working with your organization. So it is essential for you to conduct information sessions, because whatever exhaustive details you write on paper could be misunderstood, could be interpreted in multiple ways. So the best way is to have information sessions, and those sessions should be common for all the sellers. This is also a requirement from the fair point of view, that all the information that you share in the sessions have to be shared with all the sellers in the uniform way. Even if you have, for example, 5 sellers, potential sellers, and the questions come in from 2 of the sellers with regards to the queries on the RFP document or that you have shared. When you answer, the answer typically should go to all 5 of them. Okay, so this is more of a mandate during in this process, that whatever information that you share has to be shared with all the potential sellers uniformly. Okay, and once the RFP information sessions in the PMP term is bid conferences is over, then you wait for the responses from the seller. Okay, and based on their best responses, you further shortlist potentially 2 or 3, sometimes 2, sometimes 3 for the next stage. Okay, and here, those who have been working in the non-IT industry, you might be wondering then where does your request for quote or the bid comes into the play. And so the fundamental difference that you have when you are going for requesting for quote or invitation for bid or invitation to bid, what the different terms, IFB, ITB, the fundamental difference between this process and when you directly go for request for quote is, in the later, when you are going for request for quote, the stress is only on the price. So and most of the times, as I said, when you procure goods, you have the specification already, so there is not much of a room in terms of providing any value add to the buyer. So for example, if I'm procuring a printer, I have my clear specifications on what I want, and then I would be only looking for a price. So if the organization is only looking for price as a priority and not in terms of any other value adds that the seller could bring, then you go for the invitation for bid or request for quote, and whoever is the least bidder, you just award the contract. Okay, but this procurement cycle that I am explaining here is to do more with procuring manpower or procuring products where you have a lot of value add, a lot of other features that the seller can bring in. Okay, so the responses that you receive, there is also a stress on what value adds. So you have asked for that you need this particular scope to be delivered, but seller may also come back to you that yes, along with it, I might also be able to study your processes, organization processes, help consulting in terms of maturing your processes, or along with this, I can also provide you maintenance post the delivery of the project at a lower cost. So there are several value adds that the seller can provide, and that also becomes part of your evaluation criteria when you down select or shortlist the sellers based on the RFP response. Okay. Now, this again is a term which is very specific to the IT industry. Okay. So due diligence is also nowadays becoming more and more part of the entire procurement cycle, wherein you allow the potential sellers to have access to your key personnel in the organization. And what you really in this what really happens is that you have a room which has been assigned to the potential seller. Each of the seller will have one closed door room, and you will be given access to some of the document. You'll be given access to the system code if it requires, and there will be some key personnel from the buyer's organization who will answer your queries. This is a win-win situation, because the buyer may have missed out some things in the scope when they were preparing the procurement statement of work, and the seller will, through their questions, will try to identify what is the gap, and that also helps both buyer as well as the seller to to reach to a final scope before they actually sign the contract. Due diligence is more encouraged primarily to make sure that the scope is 100% covered. And this typically only happens with the final one or two potential seller that you want to work with. And based on after the due diligence, you have the negotiations round where you fine-tune the scope. You also fine-tune all other contractual legal terms and conditions, and of course the scope and the cost. And in the industry world we say it is best and final offer, or BAFO as we say, and based on the best and final offer, you modify your contracts, you modify your scope, and then the sign-off happens. Okay. Now, there are situations where, you know, during the negotiation phase, there kind of, you know, is a disagreement on certain terms and conditions in the contract. However, as a buyer, you know that, you know, you're more inclined to work towards a given seller, but you also want to make sure that the terms and conditions are being agreed before a contract can be signed off. But the seller would come back and say that, see, look, if we are delaying this whole processes, then we will also take more time to provide you the resources, because once you sign the contract, only then I can ask my organization to provide me the required resources. So as a compromise, sometimes the buyer would sign an LOI, which is called as letter of intent. Letter of intent is not a legally binding document. However, letter of intent shows that the buyer has intentions to work with the seller, and there is no contractual legal obligations from the buyer's side. So if the discussions, if the contract negotiations fail, and if the buyer chooses to work with a different seller, the seller to whom LOI was issued will have no claims whatsoever on the buyers. So it is purely more kind of a goodwill document that, yes, I have an intention to work with you, and let's sit together and close whatever outstanding issues we have with regards to the contract. Okay. So once the negotiations is complete, you have the contract that has been signed off, and you need to make sure that whatever provision you had for the time cost and procurement team in your project plan, whether you have exceeded, not exceeded, at this point of time you have to look back into the project plan and ensure that if your procurement has been prolonged based on whatever the issues would be, but you need to make sure that your project plan is updated again to show the realistic time and schedule. Okay, so now you have a seller which you have selected. Now the seller would start delivering the services or the goods, whatever is for the contract. Okay, so the green one here, when I say manage, it's more of an execution. It's more of a monitoring and controlling. Yeah, so this is where, you know, you need to the project manager role is a bit tricky. Once you have a seller working for you in your team, you have to make sure that the contract has been managed in the right way by the project manager. The project manager doesn't own the contract. You need to be very clear on this. The project manager doesn't own the contract, but the project manager is responsible to ensure that whatever deliverables have been mentioned in the contract are delivered. So although you do not own it, you still have a responsibility, you still have an obligation. And it is recommended that when you have a new vendor as part of your project team, you as a project manager have to make sure you build relationship with the vendor. The vendor now becomes a stakeholder for your project. You have to engage with the vendor in the right way. You have to treat them at par with your team members who may be belonging to your own organization. So there has to be no discrimination because he's coming from a vendor organization, then you give a secondary treatment. That is not recommended at all. You have to engage with them equally. You have to treat them equally. In all your governance meetings where the deliverables related to the vendors are discussed, you have to make them part of the governance meeting. Okay. And then when I say administer, it's coming back to the same, that the contract deliverables are happening on time as per the required quality, whatever has been mentioned in the contract terms and conditions. And as a project manager, if you feel that something has been missed out in the contract or there has to be a rectification of certain deliverables, you need to initiate the change, and you have to work with the contract manager of your organization. You can initiate the change, but the formal change in the contract can only happen with the approval of the contract manager. So the signing authority sometimes may be you if it has been specifically mentioned, but in most of the cases it is the contract manager or above who is the signing authority whenever there is a change that happens in the contract. Okay. Dispute handling is also one of the critical areas, especially because it is not a dispute within your project team, it is a dispute with an entity with whom you have a legal contract. So whenever there is a dispute, the recommendation is that you try to resolve the dispute through negotiations. You try to ensure whatever negotiations can be done with your seller, and if required involve your steering group or sponsor. But if all the negotiations fail, then there are options of arbitration, and if arbitrations also fail, then obviously you have to, there's no other option but to go to court. But in general, in real life, I have seen situations where there has been contractual dispute, but in almost 90% of the cases, we have been able to resolve it without really going to court. And that is what has been recommended. It might be long, it might be long process, painful process at times to handle disputes, but that is the reality, and you have to try your best as a project manager not to have a dispute end up in the court. Okay. And the orange box, which is in line with the closure phase. There are two types of closure. The administration closure, where you have to have all your documentation, your deliverables accepted, your resources freed, your the vendor resources might be occupying the desks in your organization, so you have to make sure those facilities are being vacated, your laptops, etc. Your user ID has been disabled for the vendor organization. So there are a lot of other administration things that you need to make sure they are closed. And financial closure, of course, is the critical part of the closure, which ensures that all the financial claims on either side are closed. So there is nothing due, nothing pending, either from the seller side or from the buyer side. And when that is done, then your procurement cycle or your contract closure happens. So the financial closure sometimes becomes tricky based on how complicated your contract is. If it's a simple T&M, then most likely it is very simple. But if it's your fixed price with your incentive or award, or with your other cost reimbursable type of contracts, based on the complexity of the contract, the financial closure takes time. Okay. So with this, we conclude the procurement cycle. Let me see how much time we have. We are almost, Saket, we are almost 1 hour, so is it okay to prolong, or?
You can, if you have some, like you can take few questions, so I can just assign them. There are not many, if possible.
Yes, but I have few more slides to cover. But then,
okay.
What do you suggest?
Okay. No, if you are at a logical end, then you can take Q&As maybe.
Yeah, but we have completed 1 hour, so if it's okay for the participants to stay back, then we can extend it for 15 more minutes.
Yeah, 15 minutes we can try.
Yeah, so let's do that. I'll just quickly walk through the slides and then take the questions.
Okay,
right?
yeah.
Okay. So these are some of the terms. Unfortunately, we are short of time, but it should be a good idea for you to go through these terms, because as a project manager, I think this is also the important thing which I missed to cover. There was one at the initial slide. We have the questions that the contract is already signed and I have now onboarded the project as a project manager. What should I do? Now, in most of the cases, or this happens. The recommendation is that you have to go through the contract once. It is mandatory for you to go through the contract once. However, if the contract document is really big, like I have seen contract documents which are like 3,000 pages, 3.5 thousand pages, because it's a big program, then you need to make sure that you read the master service agreement, which is the main copy of the main document, and then the schedules, which are more like the appendices, which are relevant to your project. Because it is very important for you to know if, as a project manager, you slip on a given timelines, or the deliverables are not up to the right quality, or there are some performance requirements. If you do not meet them, what are the financial implications? What are the penalties for you as a project manager? It is extremely important for you to go spend some time to read through the contract once. And if it's a huge contract, then make sure that at least you are aware of what is your contractual obligation, because it then makes your life easier to know what you are supposed to be contractually delivering. At the same time, if you are on the buyer side of the organization, then you have to make sure that you know what you need to expect from the seller. So either ways, you're a project manager on the buyer or the seller side, you have to read the contract at least once, and make sure that you have that handy with you throughout the project life cycle, so that you can refer to it as much as possible. In the real life scenario, it is not recommended that you open contract every single day and start fighting with your counterpart, or either buyer or the seller. The contract should be open at the last, when there is a conflict, when you are not able to resolve it through negotiations. Okay. Now, your role and responsibility in the planning phase, you need to decide what you want to procure. You need to have the right approvals taken. You need to make sure that your schedule is based on the organization procurement process. So give sufficient time in your project plan to ensure the procurement process happens. You have to detail the scope of work. You need to coordinate with the legal, with procurement, sometimes with HR and finance and other departments during the entire procurement life cycle till it is closed. Okay. During the selection phase, which is more like the execution in the PM book, you have to help in the bidder conference. You have to assist in evaluation, be part of negotiations, and you have to make sure, and this is marked in bold because it's extremely important as a project manager to make sure everything is included in the contract. And as I mentioned earlier, if the contract is already signed when you have been boarded as a project manager, you still need to go through the contract and ensure all is included. If it's not, you have to immediately raise a change request for that. Okay. Run the show. You have to establish a working relationship with your vendor. As I said earlier, treat them equally along with any other team members of your organization. You have to have governance meetings. You have to have regular reviews to monitor the progress that has been done by your seller. Manage and facilitate any changes that you need in the contract. You have to ensure your deliverables are as per the contractual terms. Of course, the financial administration part, approving the invoice, again as per the contract terms. You as a project manager can anytime conduct procurement audit through your audit departments, and that's perfectly fine. And of course monitor the cost of the entire contract. And during the closure, you have to make sure your final financial settlement happens. All the documentation, including lessons learned, are in place, and those who know about this from PM Book, you have a record management system for that. Because it's a legal thing, you have to have everything documented, and you have to ensure all your deliverables in the project are delivered. So these are some of your roles and responsibility as a project manager throughout the procurement cycle. And this is the last slide. So it's good to know that you can influence or decide what to procure, but you do not own the procurement process. It is the procurement department, the procurement manager, who owns it. In the decentralized organization setup, the procurement manager might be reporting into you, dedicated for a project, but still he owns the procurement process. And as a project manager, you are the receiver of the procurement decision. So whoever has been selected to supply goods or services, you as a project manager are the receiver party. Okay. And the procurement decision has a significant impact on the project planning. You need to be conscious about this fact. And the procurement management is becoming an integral part of the project management, especially in the services industries, not just IT. Any service industry that you take. Automobile is also service industry nowadays. Your pharma is a service industry. Your financial institutions have now started procuring manpower. Any service industry, project management and procurement management are becoming an integral part. For procuring goods, yes, project manager is involved in ensuring the specifications are right, but then beyond that, there's not much that the project manager would do once the goods or the machineries have been procured. Okay, but for the service industries, you have to be very sensitive about the fact that just like quality management, procurement management is also something the project manager has to do in his day-to-day life as a project manager. Okay. With this, I end this the webinar, and thanks for patiently listening. Those who are planning to give PMP session, PMP exam, I'm wishing you all the best. And then we'll take some questions, and we'll conclude in next 10 minutes. Yeah. Okay. During the subcontract period, due to some reason, I would like to terminate contract. In that case, should I need to pay full amount to the subcontractor, or pay only for the job done till today? Well, first of all, if whoever has written this question, I am assuming that you are part of the organization who has subcontracted, okay, to a different company. Well, in that case, your question will be answered by the type of contract you have with your subcontractor. Now, termination for the benefit of all, in real life, there are two reasons why you terminate. You terminate by convenience, or you terminate for a cause. Okay. For example, I'll give you what it means. Termination by convenience is when I, as a buyer, choose not to work with you anymore. I do not have any reason to give you, but I just don't want to work with you anymore. So I want to terminate this contract. That is a termination by convenience. Now, usually when you terminate by convenience, the buyer has to pay a big penalty to the seller because he doesn't give any reason. So it is contractually mentioned in the terms and conditions as to if the buyer terminates by convenience, what is the penalty he pays. Now, termination by cause is when the buyer can prove that the seller is not providing the services on a consistent manner as per the contract. Again, the contract covers what are the scenarios under which termination by cause holds true. So, based on your question is that I would like to terminate the contract, and should I need to pay the full amount to the subcontractor or pay only for the job done till today? Again, as I said, based on what kind of contract you have, what are the termination clauses in the contract, whatever clause is applicable, based on that, you may have to pay, you don't have to pay, or even in some cases, the seller might have to pay. Then the next question, Nitin is saying, is key personnel is working as a contracting officer representative. Again, I do not understand the this question completely, but the contracting officer representative or a contract manager or any other terms or designation role that is used within the organization, the idea is that there has to be a representative from the contract management team who will be driving the entire procurement cycle. Okay, is the seller responsible for furnish equipment and furnish space? Well, again, Nitin, based on what type of contract you are signing in, there are several contracts where the seller would say that in order for them to deliver, their manpower resources will be sitting in the buyer's organization. Okay, so in that case, the contract says that the buyer would provide them with a desk, with a facility, and furniture, table, chair, whatever to sit with. In some organization, the buyer would say that the seller will have to pay for it. So those are the terms and conditions which, as I said, during the negotiation phase, or when you are when you are having this contract written, this has to be clearly mentioned. And as I said, every single thing has to be part of your contract. So such things have to be definitely part of your contract in terms of who will provide you the furnished equipment and furnished space. Okay, the last one is, what do you mean by contract management? Please elaborate. Okay, see, as I said, those who have probably, just a second, if I have simple, yeah. Saket, are they able to see my screen or?
You can see your screen.
Yeah, okay. So I'll just flash you through a very simple statement of work, which is also, most of you would have seen it. Okay. Now this would have all your introduction, terms and scope of work, period of performance, blah blah blah. Okay. So when you have a contract in place, the contract management is to manage whatever has been mentioned in this contract right from the start till the end. So to manage whether the activities which are mentioned in the contract are being performed, whether the deliverables as mentioned in the contract are being provided on a given time frame, and then of course whether the invoicing is happening in the right way, if the seller is invoicing you in the right manner based on what type of contract you have, and of course whether the documentation is in place, is been delivered as per what the seller has promised in the contract. So contract management, if I have to sum up, is to ensure that the deliverables which are mentioned in the contract are being provided to you as a buyer, and along with that to make sure that the financial administration in terms of the invoicing is happening in the right way. So it's basically how do you manage the contract. Of course, it also includes the change request, which goes through the integral change control processes. Even the change in the contract as per the PM book process will go through the integrated change control mechanism. Okay, okay, I think that's all the questions we have.
Manish, and I am getting many thank you messages like from Manish, Ashmi. Many are saying that they had a great session, and I also thank you for taking time out and presenting the procurement thing.
Yeah,
so if you have a follow-up questions, that you can put it in a forum.isenpitch.com, and Manish also keeps looking at it. So PMP or non-PMP questions, you can put it. And many of you posted PMP related contract management question. Some of our client posted them, so I will take them in my upcoming session. We will demystify them in very proper way. So don't worry about them, or we will try to do it over the forum itself. Thank you everyone.
Okay.
Yeah, Manish, you close now.
Okay. Thanks Saket, and thanks all.